Good morning and afternoon to everyone, depending where you are based. But welcome to today's webinar that we're running for you, which is WHS Compliance 101, Practical Tips to Manage Workplace Safety. Thank you, more importantly, for taking some time off to watch this webinar with your busy schedules. Positive news, it looks like we actually already have a good amount of people who have jumped onto this webinar so far. There are actually a couple of people that say they will attend that haven't attended just yet. So we'll just give it another minute. So hang tight and we will begin shortly. Okay, so I think we're ready to get kick-started now. So ladies and gentlemen, very welcome to you all. We really appreciate your time today and we will do our best to shed light on areas of compliance when it comes to dealing with work health and safety. I'm sure throughout the presentation, you will have questions and we will go through as many as we can at the end of the webinar. But hopefully the content that we will provide for you will answer a lot of those questions that you may have. I strongly encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen so we can actually get through your questions. If we don't actually get to go through all your questions, we'll make sure we do our due diligence and have time after the webinar to follow them up for you, which I will explain a bit later. We picked the topic today, as you may or may not be aware, every October across Australia is National Safe Work Month, where the government wants to ensure that businesses build a safe and healthy workplace for all their workers. Unfortunately, WHS is always constantly something you want and you need to actually stay on top of. And it's always a topic in high demand, especially in the environment where we often get questions all the time about the safety of workers. We understand that sometimes it is quite difficult to ensure that you are up to date with WHS legislation, along with the complex laws actually surrounding it. So hopefully today we can address any questions or doubts that you may have about managing WHS and ensure that you're walking away with a bit more confidence. So before we get kick-started, I actually would love to introduce you to the speakers today. So on the right, that's actually me. My name is Perry Jagden and I am the Inside Sales Manager here at HR Assured. On the left, we are lucky enough to actually have Adrian Turner present for us today. Adrian is the head of safety of HR Assured. Today, Adrian will be walking through with you on today's webinar on WHS Compliance 101 and guiding us through understanding the requirements when it comes to managing WHS. There is another introduction I'd like to make for you all. For those who aren't familiar with our organization, on your screen are all our current members of the FCB family. There might even be some new names you haven't seen before on the screen right in front of you. Starting on the top left, we have our FCB Workplace Law, which is one of the leading and award-winning workplace relations law firms in Australia. FCB Workplace Law is the backbone of where we get all of our expertise when it comes to managing employment law and work health and safety. We also have FCB Smart Visa, which is our immigration and migration practice. Jumping over to the bottom left, we have Enable HR, which is the technology arm of FCB. Enable HR exists to help and centralize all your HR and WHS requirements on a cloud-based system. It is quite unique and it's built and maintained by our FCB Workplace Law team. So it is actually excellent for a lot of businesses to help manage their compliance, stay up to date, and more importantly, follow really good process. And finally, QMS and best practice. They're actually the newest additions or members to our family. Both QMS and best practice will be able to help out if you are looking for ISO or NDIS certification for your business. But The banner that we will be focusing on for you today is on the top right, which is HR Assured. HR Assured is an outsourced HR and WHS solution. Its slogan has always been to avoid admin and create culture you have always desired. That's one of how we actually support businesses. Most of you here have some responsibility around HR and WHS for businesses you're representing will know that probably didn't get into that position to spend so much time on ensuring that you meet legislative requirements of managing your safety of your workers, but along with all the admin that comes with it. HR Assured exists so we can take much of that work off your hands so you can better spend your time on the areas that will be more impactful to your business, such as business strategies and workplace culture. How we do this for you is that when a client comes on board, the first thing we do is do a comprehensive HR and WHS audit. This is to help diagnose what parts of the organization need assistance. If there are any critical areas of non-compliance that we find, we will jump onto it right away. We will then work with you to find all the blind spots and ensure that the business is following best practice and also ensuring that you're aware and trained about your obligations. You will also have unlimited access to our quality advisors 24/7. You will always have a professional literally at the fingertips. If you find yourself in a very tricky situation, you will have someone to turn to help you navigate it. We will also give you a cloud-based platform to help manage things to make it less complicated, so it's a lot more seamless and easier for you to manage. You will also have access to a library of legal resources from our law firm that is constantly updated. Then quite importantly, you will have access to our advice promise, which is a protection mechanism in the event if you ever receive an employment-related claim or from an employee. As everyone would be aware, sometimes no matter how well you might have managed a particular scenario, it can still unfortunately result in a claim at the end. This means you will have to defend it, which will unfortunately be a lot costly and will take a lot of time out of your day. Our advice promise means that when you do receive one of these claims, we will stand beside you, represent you, and paying the other costs associated with the claim. All of that comes included in a low monthly cost. So please, if you are interested, do reach out to us if that's something you would love to actually look into. With that in mind, I'd like to hand over to Adrian, who will now take us through today's agenda. So over to you, Adrian.
Righto, thanks very much, Perry. So I guess in terms of today's presentation, it being Safe Work Month across the country, we thought it was a really great opportunity for us to devote a whole session to WHS because it's an area that continues to have more and more emphasis coming out of the pandemic and what is a very different working world that we all have post-COVID. So we're going to spend a component of today backing over the nuts and bolts of the WHS jurisdiction, how it differs from employment relations and the fair work area that many of you will probably be more familiar with. Because I think understanding the basics of the jurisdiction is really key to understanding what practical compliance looks like on the ground and how you protect the business from the various liabilities that you have. So the refresher will allow us to dive into those more practical pointers about the type of system. You'll hear me talk a lot about system today in the presentation that needs to be in place in order to be managing WHS in the way that the law requires you to, and how a systems-based approach should apply to really perhaps the biggest trends in WHS at the moment, which is working from home and the hybrid setting, as well as psychological hazards and the risks associated with that. So with that, I'll dive into it. So to take things all the way back to basics, it's really important first and foremost to point out that unlike employment law, WHS is governed at a state level with different WHS legislation applying in each state. However, the legislation is what we call harmonised, which means the requirements across all the states are largely the same, albeit that there's slight differences, particularly in respect of in Victoria at the moment. But largely, I think it's easiest to approach WHS as having the same requirements and obligations across states, albeit that it is governed and regulated at a state-based level, unlike the Fair Work Act, which you're more familiar with, which is governed at a federal level. So I think the most important principle in WHS is that employers, or what we call PCBUs, which I'll dive into in a little bit more in a second, have a legal duty of care to ensure the safety and well-being of people within the workplace. And really important to remember that the legislation defines health as including both physical and psychological health. And so the law applies equally. And if you can bear in mind that at all times, business has to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, the duty, the well-being of staff within the workplace. And if you can get around that principle, really everything falls out of that, which we'll go into in a second. So what is a PCBU? So a PCBU is a person conducting a business or undertaking, which is a bit of a mouthful, but in its purest form, a PCBU is just anyone who operates a business. So it's 9 times out of 10, it's just the employer, but it can also be an individual if that individual is a sole trader or they're operating a business in their own right. So the PCBUs are the ones that have that legal duty of care to ensure the health and safety of workers, so far as reasonably practicable. And that's a term, again, that I'll get into in a second. But the duty to provide or ensure the well-being of people in the workplace extends and covers things like ensuring that workers are consulted with on health and safety matters, ensuring that there's proper systems of work, machinery, and equipment that are safe and properly maintained, ensuring proper facilities are available, information, training, instruction, supervision are all provided to workers. And just as important as that one is really that everyone within the workplace, including PCBUs, have responsibilities under WHS law. So in other words, there's specific responsibilities for each broad category of people within the business. So you've got your employers or your PCBUs, but you've also got your employees who have specific responsibilities to assist in the provision of a safe workplace. And also we have a specific category for what we call officers, who have the most significant individual burden under the WHS Act, again, which we'll discuss further along down. So it's important that when you're in your business, you can recognize sort of who's who in the zoo and who is responsible for what, because that dictates where the respective liabilities lie. And 9 times out of 10, for many of you in the room today, it's going to be in discharging the business's obligation to ensure that safe workplace. It's really critical that we approach things in WHS through that lens, i.e. the business has to ensure the safety of the workers. Now, obviously workers have their responsibilities, but I think it's really important to get your head around that as a concept, because it informs how we approach WHS generally. And just moving on, so it's really crucial to understand officers as well. So as I mentioned, so these are the people within the business who carry personal liability for when things go badly wrong with health and safety. And I would imagine that a number of you in the room today would be officers and actually have those individual responsibilities attached to them. It's essentially the people within an organization who have a high level of influence or management control over a business's operations. Usually the business owner, C-suite level executives, managers, senior employees, or other people in HR. And the WHS legislation requires that individual officers exercise something called due diligence to ensure compliance with WHS obligations. The officers are the ones the law says essentially puts the officers in the shoes of the business and says the PCBU has this obligation to provide for a safe workplace, and so they have the duty of care for workers. Well, the due diligence obligations and the officer provisions of the legislation puts officers in the shoes of the business and says you're responsible for carrying that out. So the business has the ultimate obligations, but the individual officers are responsible for carrying that out. And that's really important. And that's why it's so important for officers in each business to really understand that, because they sit with that liability. And so just diving into that in a little bit more detail on the next slide, it's really what due diligence is really just about safety leadership. So it's taking those steps to ensure that the company is complying with its obligations and is ensuring that they are discharging their duty of care. So it's within a section of 27 of the actual legislation, but the things that they're required to do, for example, acquire and update their knowledge about health and safety matters. They need to understand the operations of the business and the specific hazards and risks that are in play at that business. Ensure that the business has the appropriate resources to eliminate or minimize those hazards and risks, and to ensure that the business has appropriate processes in place to receive and promptly follow up on information regarding those incidents, hazards, and risks, and as well as ensuring that they have the right processes in place for complying with their other duties under the Act. So before I dive into some other key concepts, I think Perry is just going to tell you a little bit about a special offer we have at the moment, given it's Safe Work Month.
Well, there we go, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for that, Adrian. Look, more importantly, everyone take a bit of a breather and maybe a sip of water. Look, we've already covered quite a fair bit of content, and I can see from your actual questions, there are actually some really good ones in there. So please, everyone, we encourage you to keep putting those questions through. But as Adrian did mention, it is Safe Work Month. And on your screen, you can actually see a QR code for you to scan. If you do have any other further questions about WHS from what Adrian has already mentioned, or even other matters that you're finding challenging, I believe this is actually going to be very beneficial for you all. If you pull out your phone and actually scan this QR code, this will give you the chance for us to conduct a free WHS health check, which is actually valued at $750. Regardless of the industry that you're in, you have a legal obligation to be safe while you're at work. As you know, harsh penalties, fines, and even jail time can actually happen, and you've always seen it around. This WHS health check that is offered to you is actually a great stepping stone and opportunity for you to speak to one of our colleagues to uncover, areas like key risks and threats to the business, and actually help you understand what you need to do to be compliant with the current complex WHS laws that we have in Australia. You will also be issued with a detailed compliance report at the end of it as well. There are no obligations to this health check, so hopefully it's a win-win situation for you. If you actually can't scan the QR code, there will be a link on the QA form as well that you can just log in and do it that way. So what I'll do now is I'll give you a minute or so to have time to scan that QR code or go to that link to the website. So yeah, hopefully we'll get to do some WHS health checks for you all. All right, I think that's good. And look, we're actually happy to see some actually already come through. So amazing. And look, we can't forward to speaking to you once this webinar is done. So I'll pass it back to you, Adrian.
All right. So what is reasonably practicable? It's a term that you're going to hear a lot as you work more and more in the WHS space. And it's a really important term. It can be really difficult to wrap your head around, but once you do, it makes things a whole lot easier in this space. So you'll remember that we talked about PCBUs having the duty of care to ensure the health and safety of the workplace so far as reasonably practicable. And essentially what that means is it is the standard that you're held accountable to. And it means that you are doing what you are reasonably able to in order to ensure the health and safety of workers. So it essentially means that businesses need to try and eliminate first, so far as reasonably practicable. And then if the risk cannot be eliminated, then they need to reduce the risk as far as reasonably practical. And it essentially means doing what you are able to and what is within reason you are possibly able to remove that risk. So if you consider a puddle in the middle of a floor in a busy workplace, it would be expected of you that it was reasonable to eliminate that hazard altogether. There's nothing stopping the business from eliminating that hazard. If someone were to slip over that and be injured, it would be found that the business did not do everything that's reasonably practicable because the person slipped over and it was very easy to remove. So There are other cases, obviously, where there's nothing the business could have done to avoid an injury. And so the business can establish that they have done all things reasonably practicable. And that's something that turns on the facts of a particular circumstance. But if someone's going to be looking at it in terms of how far you need to go in order to control those risks, it's going to take into account, the likelihood of the hazard or risk occurring. So if we take the puddle example, if there's a puddle in the middle of the floor, it's very likely that someone's going to slip over that and hurt themselves. The degree of harm or the possible consequences that arise from that hazard or risk, what people knew about the risk before it, the availability of different ways to eliminate and minimize it, and I guess what the PCBU knows or ought to have reasonably known about the risk and the ways to have eliminated it. So it's really important. It's really trying to understand your own business and the different hazards and risks that are at play, and understanding, well, did I know about this risk, or what do I know, or what should I have known about it? That sort of helps determine how far you need to go in either eliminating it or minimizing it so far as you can. So it's really important to get your head around that concept, because you can't do everything, you can't control everything, but there are things that you absolutely have to control because of the risk that's attached to them, and that's what the law would expect you to do. And so it's important to keep that front of mind. And I guess the next part that is also, unfortunately, really important to bear in mind is that the WHS jurisdiction has an immense penalty regime attached to it, and it's actually a criminal jurisdiction. And so the sheer scale of the penalties that stem from non-compliance can really, really damage a business, and can even be fatal for them. The maximum penalty for companies is well up over $3.5 million, and for individual officers who have those specific obligations and liabilities attached that we discussed, they can go to prison and face fines in the hundreds of thousands of dollars individually. That's not something the company would pay for. That would be attached individually. And like you'll hear us talk about across our other webinars and across employment law, you also have the ability for workers to bring actions themselves in other jurisdictions for things that are essentially injuries that they occur at the workplace, but not specifically actioned within the WHS jurisdiction. So things like the Fair Work Act, discrimination acts, as well as workers' compensation claims that arise from injuries in the workplace. If you couple them with the penalties and the investigations that can be brought about by the WHS regulator in each state, you've just got so many different risks when it comes to not complying with your WHS obligations that can really damage your business, and why it makes it so important to put a system in place so that you are picking up on those injuries before that they happen. But in the unfortunate event that they do, you've got something there sitting there to be able to demonstrate, hey, we did do everything reasonably practical. It's out of our hands. We couldn't have avoided that risk, because look at the system we've got. That helps protect you from all of those claims that are possible that I just discussed. So really, really important to bear that in mind. And it's really important why to make sure that the individuals in the business responsible for it understand that. We've at HR Assured, we've based the system that we provide our clients to comply with all the key obligations and to really immunize you from those risks. And so when you sign up, you are provided with almost a system ready to go and implement, to give you that evidence base in the event that something happens to point to and say, look what I've got in place. That's the nature of our system, paired with the ongoing 24/7 advice that we provide. It helps provide you with the tools that you need to manage compliance. And so just onto that next slide, what does WHS management look like in practice? The starting point is that, like I mentioned, the obligation is on the business to eliminate risks to health and safety in the workplace first and foremost. If you've got a serious risk to your people, the obligation on you is to eliminate it and remove any chance of that risk happening. But if you cannot eliminate it, if it's unreasonable to eliminate it altogether, then your obligation is to minimize that risk. so far as you can, so far as reasonably practicable. So I think the challenge a lot of the time with WHS compliance is that what the law deems to be reasonably practical differs in each particular scenario based on the facts of that situation. And so there's obviously a tendency a lot of the time for employers to get WHS compliance wrong in one of two ways. So either they become really overwhelmed with the complexity and the work involved against all their other things that they need to do in a business that they never really make a proper start on it, or I see a lot of businesses tie themselves up in knots almost trying to cover each and every possible risk scenario, which naturally impacts on an efficient operation of any business. And so to me, really the most effective way to manage WHS is to keep things as simple as possible and rely on an effective management system for WHS that integrates into the business. And that really does not need to be complicated. It certainly doesn't need to be groundbreaking. And that's the simplicity of a system that protects you is exactly what we've modeled our service on. And so again, everything with managing hazards and risks comes down to a really simple framework that you can see on that slide. And that is first identifying the hazards in your business, then assessing the risks of those hazards, then controlling those risks, i.e. what do we need to put in place to reduce those risks to a level that we are comfortable with and that we can live with if we can't remove it altogether. And then constantly reviewing your hazards and consulting with your workers about all of those things in your business to make sure that you're always on top of the specific hazard and risk that you have in your particular business. And so if, I guess, discharging your duties is about creating a system or framework for doing that, what are the elements of a system when I talk about that? So what are the things that are embedded into a system that help protect you and that help comply with everything you need to do? So the first one really is creating what is a safe physical and online working environment. So no matter where you're working, what the environment is, it's got to be secure, it's got to have some level of natural surveillance and people feel safe. So when you're managing the risk of remote work, it means ensuring you have measures in place to monitor employee health and well-being, check-in surveys, etc. We'll get into it a little bit in a second, but first and foremost, making sure your people feel safe at work, whatever that might look like. So making appropriate security, etc. That's fundamental. It starts there. The next one is creating those processes of work and making sure that the way you do work is safe and it's underpinned by safe procedures. So, do you have procedures that people follow and are aware of for how you do your work? Does it accord with something someone has written down and made safe for people and everyone understands it? It's socialized within your business in a way that protects people. So the next one I would say is having best practice workplace policies related to that first one. So it's so important to make sure you're reviewing your workplace policies and procedures to ensure that you're equipping your employees with the information they need to do work safely. So appropriate workplace policies, they really help determine if employees have been provided with the direction that they need in order to perform the work safely. So if you haven't provided for your workers the procedure by which they are to work and say, this is how we do our work and this is how we do it safely, then it's going to be very difficult for you to establish that you've done everything reasonably practicable to protect them at work. How have you taught them or how have you shown them that this is how to do their work safely? That differs industry to industry and business to business, but the concept of having clear workplace policies and procedures that governs all that is fundamental, and it's fundamental to any compliance system, and it's something that we provide for every business when we get them set up and running with our system. So obviously, once you've got your policies and procedures in place, regular training and the provision of information to your workers about those policies and procedures is fundamental as well. So, regular training for your workers in how to assess the hazards and risks in the work that they do and how to perform their work safely is just as important as the initial policy and procedure that you've got for doing that. The other one I would say is having things in place to make sure that unsafe behaviour and hazards are addressed early. It's part of a culture piece that I'll discuss in a second. But it's just really, really important that there's a culture being fostered that unsafe work behaviours are really stamped out and that they're addressed early, and the business has that positive safety culture at all times, that everyone's looking after each other and making sure that things are being done safely. Um, uh, the other one, again, related to that point, is consultation. So consultation is a fundamental obligation every business has under the legislation. And what it means is that for each and every health and safety matter, that workers are being consulted with and they're having their views heard about, and that's contributing to how those hazards and risks are being treated. So the easiest way to think about consultation is each and every matter that is related to health and safety in the business, you have an obligation to talk to your employees about it. There's no obligation to necessarily do what your employees say, but the obligation to consult with them is there. And if there was an incident that occurred in a workplace, one of the first things an investigator or regulator is going to do in that process is consider what, if any, consultation there was had. So had your workers, had you had a meeting about how to do this particular thing safely? Had you asked for employees' feedback about whether something can be done safely? That's fundamental. It's something they're going to check each and every time. And so having procedures in place to make sure you're doing that regularly and keeping records of it is really important. It's something that's embedded into the solution that we provide our clients first and foremost. So the next piece, I think, which is crucial and is often overlooked, is safety culture. And I think culture generally is often, it's become almost ubiquitous, and it's I think somewhat overused in workplace compliance. But I think when it comes to managing your WHS duties, it's so fundamental to create a safety culture that overarches everything, because without it, you will not create a proactive system, rather you'll create a reactive system. And so people will be chasing the tail all the time. But whereas as an employer, it's really your obligation to set behaviour standards that provide for the safe workplace. So you set the standard of how you prioritise the safety and wellbeing of your workers and how you respond to issues to keep them safe and healthy. And so you really want the way you approach safety to be seen and evidenced. You want your employees to feel safe at work and to feel the importance, I should say, that you as a business place on their safety. And so if you can find ways to approach safety in a way that is first and foremost and that is clearly demonstrable to your employees, you're going to find it much, much easier, not only to prevent injuries from actually occurring, but to be able to evidence in the event that something goes wrong, how you approach safety and why it wasn't reasonably, it was something that was unforeseeable and not reasonably practical for you to have fixed, when you have all these different examples of the way or the priority that you place on safety, that this one thing fell through the gaps because it was unavoidable. So I think it's really crucial. It's finding different things you can build into your ways of work that foster safety culture, and it's really, really important. And it's something that's probably a little bit more intangible that we make part of the system that we provide our clients and the advice that we're constantly providing over the phone. All right, so mental health and WHS, again, it's often forgotten about that the law treats mental health and psychological health in the exact same way that it does for physical health. So often it's forgotten about in the workplace health and safety sphere, because workplace health and safety has traditionally been about hammers and hard hats and construction sites and keeping people safe, which it absolutely is, but it's just as easily or more or less exactly the same as applied to mental health and psychological hazards. And there's, coming out of COVID, there is a really bright light shining on mental health and how we fix a lot of the psychological issues and hazards that have come out of working from home and the pandemic and the pressure that put on everyone. And there's regulatory and governmental action being applied in each jurisdiction to try and fix these issues. And so what it means is that businesses are under more pressure to make sure that they've got a system in place to prevent those injuries occurring, and or that they can show in the event of an incident that they did have something in place to have prevented that mental health issue developing for the worker. And so that looks very different for mental health as it does to physical health in terms of the types of hazards and the way that those injuries manifest. But the way you treat them and the system that you need to have in place is exactly the same. It's just applying to a different type of injury. So it's really important, I think, first and foremost, that everyone doesn't look at psychological health and physical health differently, only that they manifest in different ways, and we've got to be conscious of more things. But in terms of the ways we control it and what we need to have in place, exactly the same. And so if you look at some of the types of psychological hazards that you see in a workplace, you're probably sitting there thinking, is there any situation that isn't a psychological hazard? And I completely understand that. What I think the list on the screen shows is that it's really complex, and understanding this sphere is really, really difficult because, on the one hand, you've got over demand on a worker being a psychological hazard. You've also got under demand being a hazard. So how does that compute, and how do we reconcile that as managers in creating safe systems of work? You'll have people working at home almost 24/7 these days, or permanently. They're still under pressure to deliver work and keep the business active, but from home. They're doing so in an environment where they're not surrounded by some of the social aspects that help offset some of those psychological hazards, and they don't interact with people as much as they may have done if they were in the office. And so, there's always going to be hazards from a psychological perspective, in the same way that slippery floor is a physical hazard. Not having not having check-ins and not having social interaction with people can really see those psychological hazards develop, in the same way that over demand and having overbearing managerial relationships and demand on the worker create stress and lead to burnout and create other types of psychological hazards. So what we really need to do in addressing those areas is make sure, like we talked about, that simple model for having things in place to first identify in your business, where are those pressure points, where are the things that could stem into injuries if not treated properly, where are they? Identify those things, then assess, okay, what are the risks of that hazard when they manifest. So if it's a hazard of someone working at home and not being regularly checked in on or provided clear instructions or to be managed appropriately, what's the risk of that? Could be stress, could be burnout. What could result from that is a psychological injury. That's quite serious, which means we need to put in place control measures to try and control that, and be able to demonstrate again that if something were to happen, that, hey, we did try to do something about this. Look at all these things that we did. That was everything that's reasonably within our power to have stopped that, and we shouldn't be held liable for that, even though there was an injury that developed. So you've really just got to apply that same framework to every single type of injury, regardless of it's psychological or physical. And so COVID-19, again, this is something that everyone will appreciate changes almost daily. And at the moment, we're at a place where COVID is much more out in the open, if you like, with some of the easing of restrictions that are out there. Again, I think you've got to look at COVID-19 in the exact same way that you look at psychological hazards or physical hazards. It's just a risk to the health and safety of your people at work. And so it's a matter for each business to put in place mechanisms to make sure that in their workplace, you're controlling COVID at a level that's reasonably practical. The regulators in each state, the WHS, are telling us that they recognise COVID's a complex beast with many, many variables, and that public health orders are ever changing. So really what their enforcement approach looks like is going to have regard to the factors in place at any one time. as long as you can demonstrate that as a business, you have assessed the risk of COVID in your own workplace and you've taken those steps to make sure that you're managing it or that people are protected so that the workplace isn't the place in which people are spreading or that they're exposed to unreasonable level of risk, then you're going to be okay. The reality is these things are changing almost daily, but they're getting to a place now where COVID-19 is far more in the community than it may have been previously, and so that the way in which we treat it is changing accordingly. So just making sure you've got basic measures in place. You've done risk assessment for your particular business. If you're in a workplace with people who are exposed or compromised by COVID in a way that is different to others or at a higher level, then you're naturally going to need to have higher levels of control for COVID in that business because the risk is too great. If you're not having a lot of physical contact between people, and you're dealing with people who are generally far healthier and less exposed, then sometimes the COVID provisions that need to be in place are lessened. But as long as you have something in place, you've done that risk assessment, you can show it, then you're largely going to be okay based on what the regulators have told us over the last 12 months. So working from home, again, there's lots of different ways in which you can approach this. I think the main thing, again, to just ram home that point, is that you just need to be able to show that you have taken steps to ensure that workers are safe when they're working from home. So that includes the physical environment they're in, as well as the psychological hazards that they're exposed to, and making sure that there's a checklist or whatever it is that the business can satisfy itself that when their people are working from home, they're not unreasonably exposed to injury, and you can show that. So there's lots of different ways you can do that. Office-based employees, having that initial work from home checklist to make sure that things are being set up physically in a way that's conducive to safe work, but also what are your mechanisms for managing that employee while they're working from home? How are you managing the psychological hazards? Having that documented somewhere and enforced through your middle managers in the business is really, really important. And as long as you can show that, then again, generally you're going to be okay. But with nothing in place, with no system underpinning it, no policies and procedures, you're really going to struggle, and you're going to expose yourself to risk as a business. And that's why we've designed the system that we provide our clients based on covering all your bases and making sure you've got that base documentation in place, but also record keeping functionality within the HRA cloud to be able to show that you're doing all of these things. Again, I think, guys, we've covered most of this. There's lots of different things that you can put in place in managing what are in effect psychological hazards. So you look at the examples on the screen. You set clear and realistic instructions for workers about how they're working from home, check-ins with staff, making sure that they've always got access to the systems and the technology they're required to do their work safely, monitoring how much they're working, check that their work and the way that they do it can be adjusted based on them being at home compared to being in the office, keeping employees informed of organisational work, team updates, finding ways for social interaction despite the employee being from home, and just making sure that they feel supported and part of a team environment at all times is really, really important. And so I think that pretty much concludes the technical aspects of the presentation. I know that there's going to be quite a few questions. I can see them building up, so I'm sure we'll get to them in a second. I think Perry is going to take you through another one of our offers for Safe Work Month before we do that.
Now, on top of the WHS health check that we are providing, that I did mention earlier in the webinar, for the rest of the month of October, what we're doing for you all is actually offering 20% off all our WHS management systems. If you're actually very serious about your WHS and you want to save time and money, especially around the admin side, and you want to hear more about this offer, please get your phones out or click the link and scan that QR code. We will get in contact with you ASAP once you do put this QR code into your phone. Look, from us, look, we can confidently say that this will be the solution that you will need to help manage your WHS. So what we'll do is we'll give you a minute, take your phones out, and yeah, we'll scan the QR code. Well, there we go, everyone. Look, thanks again for Adrian for all the valuable content that you have provided. And look, more importantly, we do hope it was a breath of fresh air for you all. Look, personally, I feel like I've learned a new thing or two, and I thought I was on top of legislation, but I'm sure that you did learn a couple of things there as well. Look, let's say it was definitely informative, and I'm sure you all want to give Adrian a bit of a pat on the back for that. Now you've walked away with the opportunity here with our two initiatives. So the free health check and obviously the 20% WHS services, all there for you at the fingertips. Now, I think to wrap this up, more importantly, before we go through questions, we really do hope that you took some notes. If you do have any questions at all, please take your phones out. Don't hesitate to scan that QR code or give us a call. Just to add the cherry on top, and you're already asking here through the Q&A, not only will you get the recording of this webinar, which we will distribute to you on the emails that you registered with, one of our colleagues will actually give you a call just to help you in, assist with any initial queries that you may have. But also as well, if you actually forgot to scan the QR code or maybe the link's not working, that's why my colleagues are there to help assist those questions. So we will do everything we can to help you as much as we can. Now, let's get into one of the important areas of this webinar, which is the questions. Look, Adrian and I are scrolling through it, and look, there's quite a fair few. And you know what? There's some complex ones here as well. So look, we'll do everything we can to get through them all, but I am very conscious of not of our time, but also your time as well. But look, if we can't get through your questions today, we will make sure we will contact you right after this webinar. So here we go, Adrian. Here are some of the questions that have been left for us. Now, we have a small business with an office-based employees. We believe WHS is a low risk for our workplace. We currently do not have a WHS management system in place. Do I need to have a system in place, and what are the ramifications if I don't have a WHS management system?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And, the reality is for a business that is lower risk, so a basic office type environment, the chances of a serious WHS incident happening are lower, and that's just the reality of it. However, the law approaches every single business and puts the same obligations on every single business, whether you're a tiny office based employer or a multinational construction company. You have the same, that the law applies to you exactly the same. So you need to have if you can't, like we spoke about a fair bit throughout the presentation, if you can't demonstrate to a regulator or someone who is investigating an incident that you had something to protect or to minimize those incidents occurring, then straight away you're going to be held liable because you hadn't done what's reasonably practical. The system is about helping you do what's reasonably practical to avoid those incidents. And so you absolutely must have one. And that's why our system has been designed for all different levels of an employer with different complexity in their business, because the law applies in exactly the same way. So you do need that system regardless of the risk level in your particular business.
Perfect. Thanks for that. Now, I think this is actually a good question, but why do businesses need a WHS management system? Is it okay if we just manage it manually?
Yeah, so it's almost the same answer, in the sense that a WHS management system is the collation or everything that you need in order to comply with the legislation as part of one system that works together. And so there's different ways of doing that. When we talk about when you ask about manually, I tend to think of manually these days as being very paper-based. And in today's workplace and in the modern age, managing things in old school, if you like, paper-based manners is just really difficult to keep up with and to make sure that you're doing everything you can. And so being able to document it and evidence it in the event of something happening is much more difficult. Whereas if you put it into something like a cloud-based system like HRA Cloud, it never goes anywhere. It's set up against what your compliance requirements are, so that at any time you can draw on it if you need it. And so it's nothing to say that you can't manage things manually, if you like, or through paper-based systems. It's just far, far easier for businesses who already are very time poor to do that with a cloud-based system.
Perfect. I'm very conscious. So here we go. We got one last question, and I tried to put them all together with this one here, but I know it won't cater to all. But what WHS policies and procedures do you recommend every business, small, medium, or large, must have? And how often should we actually review these processes? And is this something that our services HR Assured can provide?
Yeah, look, I think again, it's about each business is a little bit different in terms of what different policies and procedures they absolutely must have. I think about any business that does what we call high risk construction work. The legislation mandates that you have things called safe work method statements. You absolutely have to have them. And if something were to happen and you didn't, you'd be held liable. But different businesses, it's a little bit horses for courses in terms of what is most important to have. All I'll say is that a good WHS management system has everything in it, and a WHS management system contains all of those policies and procedures, together with different processes on the ground to manage all of your compliance obligations. So you obviously have things like your WHS policy statement. Do you have safe work procedures that govern how you do particularly hazardous tasks safely? Do you have a risk management procedure? Do you have a way that you do risk assessments? All those things are part of a workplace health and safety management system, and are just as important as the other, because all things sort of tie together. They all operate or supposed to operate hand in glove. So, I wouldn't say that any one aspect is more important than the other. But certainly things like safe work method statements and procedures for doing stuff that is really hazardous. So if you're operating hazardous machinery, you're doing work at heights, anything that is high risk, you need to have procedures and processes to govern that first and foremost. But then certainly outside of that, your policies and procedures are equally as important. They're all sort of part of one harmonious whole.
Thank you. Well, everyone, look, that's the time that wraps it up, and look, and that's it from us today. So look, thank you so much again for spending time with us again to watch this webinar. Look, we do really hope that you took advantage of the initiatives that we are offering, but more importantly, walked away with information that will be valuable to you and the business. Look, we do these webinars quite regularly, so please keep a lookout and please tune in as well. But we'll get in contact with you very soon. So more importantly, take care, stay safe, and enjoy the rest of your day. All right, see you later.
Thanks, everyone.